Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a closer look, a guided clinical seminar really, into a truly foundational paper by Alvarez. It's called Levels of Therapeutic Work and Levels of Pathology, the Art of Calibration.
Yeah, and our mission today isn't just to give you a summary. We want to actually read with you, think through Alvarez's ideas together.
Exactly. To pull out those nuggets, those insights that can genuinely sharpen your clinical intuition, especially if you're an early career psychologist listening.
And the real core idea, the one we'll keep coming back to, is calibration.
Right. Calibration. Alvarez talks about it as this precise adjustment the therapist makes.
Adjusting their approach based on the patient's specific suffering. Their level of internal organization, how severe things are.
It's very dynamic, isn't it? An ongoing thing, not just setting something once.
Absolutely. It's about really meeting the patient where they are internally.
And definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach to therapy. You really can't just apply the same technique across the board.
No, you can't. I like the analogy you mentioned earlier, like tuning a really sensitive instrument.
Yeah, that's it. Every patient has this unique, complex internal world, their own kind of melody of suffering and capacity.
And the therapist has to constantly fine-tune their way of being, their interventions, to resonate with that specific melody.
So why is this calibration so critical then? What does Alvarez hinge it on?
Well, she says it really hinges on the patient's capacity to contain and to use the interpretation. That's the key phrase.
Okay, so you need to figure out, can they actually take in symbolic insights? Can their mind process what you're offering?
Yeah, exactly. Or is the main thing they need right now for you to just be a container? For those really raw, primitive emotional states that they can't handle themselves.
And the overall goal is always, well, it's about fostering the patient's own ability to mentalize, right?
Right. Helping them develop that capacity to understand minds, their own and others' thoughts, feelings, intentions, and through that, reduce their suffering.
Okay, so let's dig into the landscape Alvarez maps out. She describes this spectrum of pathological levels. Understanding these seems fundamental to doing this calibration properly.
It really is. Let's start at one end. Primitive or psychotic pathology.
Okay. Primitive states.
No.
What are the characteristics here?
Well, at this level, you're looking at a really fundamental disturbance in what she calls the thinking apparatus, or, what Bien called alpha function.
Alpha function, right? The mind's ability to process experience, turn raw stuff into thoughts.
Precisely. And patients here really struggle to process what Bien called beta elements. Those are the raw, undigested bits, sensory data, raw emotions.
So instead of becoming thoughts, these beta elements, what happens to them?
They're often just experienced as unbearable psychic pain, or they get kind of evacuated, pushed out through things like projective identification.
Projective identification, where you unconsciously put unbearable feelings into someone else.
Exactly. And the result internally is often severe fragmentation, confusion between self and other, just intense, awful suffering.
And Alvarez makes the point, doesn't she, that even in people who aren't overtly psychotic, you can have psychotic parts of the personality operating.
Yes, that's crucial. Moments where these primitive, unprocessed states take over.
Yeah.
You see this in schizoid or paranoid states, autistic states, certain narcissistic organizations too.
So you might observe things like primitive anxieties, primitive ways of relating to others, very basic thinking, maybe even communication that feels really rudimentary.
That's right. All those primitive markers.
Okay, so given this profound difficulty in processing, how does the analyst's role shift? What's the primary task when working with these states?
Well, for patients who lack that developed alpha function, the analyst basically becomes the container. You act as the processing unit, in a way, for their undigested beta elements.
So the patient projects the raw stuff, terror, fragmentation into the analyst.
And the analyst, using their own working alpha function through what's called reverie, that kind of receptive musing state, metabolizes these beta elements.
Turns them into alpha elements, more digestible thoughts or feelings.
Yes. And then returns them to the patient, maybe through an interpretation, but in a form that's now more understandable, more manageable.
So the patient can slowly start to internalize that function for themselves. It's like you're lending them your processor until they build their own.
Beautifully put. It's a profound kind of internal digestion process happening between the two people.
Now, thinking clinically, for someone starting out, it seems easy to miss this dynamic, doesn't it? To maybe see these raw beta elements as just resistance or the patient being difficult?
Oh, absolutely. It's a common pitfall.
How might you recognize it? Like, if a patient suddenly gets totally overwhelmed, or maybe you start feeling overwhelmed, flooded, confused by their material, Could that be a sign, a beta element needing containment?
That's often exactly how it feels. That sense of being overwhelmed in the countertransference can be a key indicator that you're dealing with beta elements.
And the danger is pushing for insight, for an interpretation about meaning, when what's actually needed is just holding, containment.
Precisely. Providing the container is the primary intervention at that moment. Pushing for symbolic meaning too soon can be countertherapeutic, even fragmenting.
Let's make this concrete. You mentioned a clinical example, Dr. Moorshaked.
Yes. Imagine Dr. Moorshaked is working with a very withdrawn child. She gets this brilliant idea, a really insightful interpretation about how the child's play is symbolically enacting a past trauma.
Okay. Sounds like good work.
But she pauses. She asks herself, wait, is this interpretation too symbolic? Is it too soon? Am I reaching for meaning here before I've really established attunement, before I've contained the rawness?
So in Alvarez's term, she's calibrating, right there in the moment.
Exactly. She's asking, is this child's thinking apparatuses ready for an alpha element interpretation? Or are they communicating mainly through beta elements that need my processing first?
And Alvarez warns, doesn't she, that misinterpreting that primitive communication as if it were neurotic, as if it already had symbolic meaning readily available, can actually harm the treatment.
She does. It really highlights how vital it is to differentiate these states.
Okay, so moving along Alvarez's spectrum, what comes after the primitive psychotic level?
We get to borderline pathology. Think of this as sitting on a developmental continuum, somewhere between the psychotic and the neurotic levels.
Right, so they share some features with primitive states, like using projective identification.
Often quite heavily. But they generally have a more stable ego structure than you'd see in full psychosis, though it's still fragile.
And the internal world is often described as, well, marked by intense splitting, chaotic emotions, difficulty integrating different parts of themselves in their experience.
Yes, that's characteristic. You see intense splits, black and white thinking, very turbulent emotional states. Alvarez mentions different forms: structural, borderline, narcissistic, borderline, even these borderline arousal states linked to that shaken psyche idea in psychosis.
So understanding that internal chaos, how does that guide the therapy? How do you calibrate here?
Well, thankfully, our ability to work with these patients has developed a lot, but it demands a specific kind of therapist stance. Alvarez talks about the therapist's internal calibration.
Internal calibration meaning?
Meaning your ability to perceive accurately, but also to cope with these really intense, often undifferentiated states the patient brings, to not get completely pulled under by them.
So containment is still key.
Absolutely. Containing the patient's mental states is crucial. And alongside that, really acknowledging and managing your own countertransference.
Your emotional reactions to the patient, using them as information rather than just reacting.
Exactly. It's a vital tool here. The work is often about transforming these intense internal states, still involving processing those beta elements that haven't been fully digested.
So if you're sitting with a patient and they're just swinging between intense, chaotic emotions, what's the first thing Alvarez might suggest tuning into?
Probably tuning into the quality of the state itself rather than just the content, and tuning into your own internal state. That internal calibration piece is key when you feel overwhelmed or chaotic yourself in response to their projections.
Using your own feeling state as a guide to theirs, almost, but without getting lost in it.
Precisely. It's a delicate balance.
Okay. And then, at the other end of the spectrum from the primitive states,
We arrive at neurotic pathology.
right, neurotic level. This generally means a more developed alpha function, yeah. A better capacity for thinking, symbolizing.
Generally, yes. The core issues here are usually understood as intrapsychic conflicts. Think classic psychoanalysis conflicts between ego, id, superego, often rooted in the Oedipus complex.
The Oedipus complex, that developmental stage dealing with desire, rivalry, shaping our internal structures.
That's the one. And the defenses used here are typically more mature. Things like repression, displacement, isolation, maybe rationalization or intellectualization.
So unlike the primitive states, these patients usually have a pretty strong ego, good reality testing. They know what's real.
Yes, generally a robust connection to external reality. The anxiety they feel is considered neurotic anxiety. Still painful, of course, but usually more manageable, more interpretable within the therapy.
And they have a sense of others and themselves as whole people, not just split off parts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A sense of a whole object. And Alvarez notes they engage in active and continuous integration activity. They're trying to make sense of things, pull things together.
And a key emotional feature often mentioned is guilt, right? which suggests a more integrated internal world, even if it's conflicted.
Yes, guilt points towards a functioning superego and a capacity to feel concern, which is different from the fragmentation or terror seen in more primitive states.
So, therapeutically, how does the calibration differ here? The suffering is more amenable to traditional interpretation.
It usually is. The main focus becomes interpreting those internal conflicts, aiming for insight, particularly around adable themes, helping release repressed material, promoting more integration.
And working through the transference is central. How the patient unconsciously relates to you based on past figures.
Absolutely key. And the therapist's role involves helping the patient internalize the therapist's own capacity to contain and interpret their internal world. It facilitates insight and working through those core conflicts.
So let's think about that calibration again. If you have a neurotic patient using, say, intellectualization to avoid feeling something,
Yeah.
how is Alvarez's calibrated approach different than how you'd approach someone using projective identification?
Well, with intellectualization in a neurotic patient, you might interpret the defense itself and the underlying conflict as warding off, aiming for insight. You're assuming they can symbolize and think about it, even if they're avoiding it.
Whereas with projective identification,
The first step is often containment. Receiving the projection, processing it yourself, and only then, perhaps offering a very carefully worded interpretation, maybe naming the feeling involved or turning it in a digestible form. The capacity for symbolization isn't assumed in the same way.
so their existing capacity for symbolization and integration is really vital for that more classic interpretive work.
Absolutely. It dictates what kind of intervention is possible and helpful, which brings us right back to the therapist's crucial skill.
Differentiation.
Yes, it underpins the entire calibration process. Being able to differentiate between levels of disturbance, types of internal organization, even fluctuating states within the same patient from moment to moment.
And without that ability to differentiate, your calibration is off. Your interventions might miss the mark or worse.
Right. Differentiation gives you that precise understanding of the pathology, and it directly tells you which therapeutic tools are appropriate right now. It's not just a diagnostic label, it's a dynamic assessment guiding action.
It sounds like it also involves differentiating your own internal reactions, managing your countertransference, that receptive process you mentioned.
Hugely important. If you can't tell what's yours and what's being projected into you, especially with more primitive states, you can get completely swamped and lose your therapeutic effectiveness.
This whole idea of differentiating levels of pathology, it has a long history in psychoanalysis, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. Goes back to Freud, distinguishing neuroses from psychoses, but then hugely refined by people like Klein, Bion, Meltzer, Segal, Rosenfeld, Steiner. They gave us the conceptual tools to understand these more primitive mental states much more deeply. Alvarez builds on that lineage.
And ultimately, a big part of the therapy, especially with patients functioning at more primitive levels, is helping them develop their own capacity for differentiation.
That's a key therapeutic goal, helping them distinguish internal from external, self from other, feeling from thought, leading towards greater psychological integration.
Towards developing what Alvarez calls a thinking heart. I like that phrase.
Me too. It captures that capacity to really process emotional experience internally, to tolerate mental pain, and to actually think about feelings, not just be overwhelmed by them or evacuate them.
So Alvarez's framework, this whole idea of calibration grounded in differentiation, it really offers a profound way to think about tailoring our stance, doesn't it? Moving beyond formulas.
It really does.
Yeah.
Truly meeting the patient where they are in all their complexity.
It reminds us that our work is just this continuous process, sensing, containing, discerning, adjusting. It really is an art of calibration.
That ongoing dynamic adjustment, moment by moment, with each unique person. It's demanding, but incredibly rewarding when you get it right.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe here's a thought for you, the listener, to take away. Something to mull over as you go into your next session, or just find a quiet moment for reflection. Can you now explain Alvarez's central insight, this idea of calibration, in your own words, simply and clearly? If you can't, or if it still feels a bit fuzzy, that's okay. Actually, Alvarez might say that's beautiful, because that's where your work begins.